members, CIB members, and all those who are our benefactors, and also those who subscribe to CIB. Today, indeed, we have some of the excellent speakers, researchers, and very distinguished faculty members from around the world. We have two of those today. So let me give a quick introduction to Dr. Fred Sherratt and Professor Billy Hare. And bear with me as I read through their bio. It's very extensive and very elaborate. So bear with me. But before I do that, you probably notice on the screen here that it says 70th anniversary. So I just wanted to point out that CIB this year gets to be 70 years old. And indeed, yes, a moment to clap. Thank you. So we'll be kickstarting some of the celebrations later this year, and you'll hear Professor Hare also talk about it during part of his presentation. So with that said, let me give a quick introduction to our two speakers. We have Professor Fred Sherratt here with us physically, and Fred has over 10 years of experience working on construction sites for a large main contractor in the UK, as well as over 10 years experience as an academic working in UK universities. She's a chartered builder, a chartered building engineer, and an associate member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Her previous academic position in the UK was Professor of Construction Sociology, and she is now an Associate Director of Research at the Construction Safety Research Alliance at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Fred's research has always prioritized construction workers with a focus on their occupational safety, health, and well-being. Having seen the consequences of poor OSHW in practice firsthand, she endeavors to undertake impactful and, more importantly, useful research that is able to support and help develop industry improvements that bring positive change to practice. Professor Sherratt is currently International Joint Coordinator of the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, CIB Working Group, W099. That is for research of construction industry safety, health, and well-being, and regularly publishes and presents her work to both industry and academic audiences around the world. Let me give a quick introduction to Professor Billy Hare. Professor Hare is presently a professor of construction management within the School of Computing, Engineering, and Built Environment at Glasgow Caledonian University in the UK. He is Deputy Director of the school's Research Center for Building Environment and Asset Management, also known as BEAM, and also former chair of the school ethics committee. Billy has a PhD in construction, H&S management, health and safety management, BSc honors in construction management, and a BA in occupational health and safety. He joined GCU in 2002 after a career in construction contracting. Since then, he has delivered research on several HSE, IOSH, EPSRC, CITB, and many other funded projects totaling over £1 million. He has written over 50 plus peer-reviewed publications and impact case studies for the UK research excellence in construction industry, including studies that have improved worker engagement, migrant goals for good health and well-being, and decent work. Billy is currently International Joint Construction Safety, Health, and Well-being Coordinator, Working Group Coordinator, and chair of several other industry working groups. His expert commentary is often sought by the media, and he is appointed as the Senior Advisor for Buildings and Construction for the independent review of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital infections of 2018-19. He has recently established a database for analyzing suicide rates among construction occupants and is leading the Measuring Wellbeing Group for the UK Make It Visible initiative. So with that said, please welcome both of our speakers.
Thank you, Mike. Well, good morning, everybody. Hello. Oh, I've been teaching again. Welcome in, folks. So, obviously, I'm Fred Sherratt. I've got Billy in Glasgow. Obviously, I'm not from America. I'm from Manchester in the United Kingdom, best city in the world. But luckily, I now have a great job at the University of Colorado at Boulder, working with the CSRA there. So I just want to, if you're online, can you mute your mic, please? Hello? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So I just want to prove to you that you can run a construction job site with inch-long pink acrylic fingernails. Oh, no, it doesn't like that. And also, no, it's not. Obviously you can see there the Manchester skyline in the background on one of the jobs that I worked on for over 10 years. I was a contractor. I was a site superintendent, the equivalent of here. I never made it to a project manager because I just don't like wearing suits. So obviously I also taught for 10 years. You can see some of my graduates there. And I do deliver, try and support construction workers across the world. And you can see me there. That's with the Ghanaian Minister for Labour at an event I presented at in Accra. Obviously now I work at the CSRA, where we work directly with over 80 companies within the construction industry and co-create our research through a really, really interesting way of developing, finding out what we want to research, exploring the possibilities and undertaking empirical research that actually has practical value right from the very start, which is something very, very important to me. My whole raison d'etre for being in this field is simply that I've seen too many people have accidents and get hurt, folks I worked alongside, and I am very, very much about looking after construction workers in the field. I'm going to pass to Billy now. Billy, can you unmute and tell us a little bit about some of these pictures, love?
Yes, that was how long it took me to unmute. That's so thank you, everyone. Hopefully you can understand the Scottish accent. The images you should see now on the screen are a nice collection of my involvement with CIB over the years. The rather youthful looking image to the left is one of my first CIB conferences. The one with the larger oversized helmet I think was in Melbourne, Australia, and a few others since leading up to the Glasgow event, which had to be online, hence the earphones during the COVID era. I've even thrown in, just to try and show off a little, an interview with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which went worldwide when the Glasgow School of Art caught fire a few years ago. So you can see there that I'm listed on the BBC as a construction expert, so it must be true. Along the bottom are some images of me with the hard hat on, just to let you see I do get engaged in some physical work on construction sites, as well as an acknowledgement of the research centre that I'm a director of here in Glasgow.
Thanks, Billy. That's great. We'll come back to you later on. But for now, I'm just going to take you on an absolutely whistle-stop tour of occupational safety, health, and well-being within the construction and civil engineering fields. So let's go back in time. This is some photos from Manchester taken last week. No, they're not. But of course, this is where it all started. Very first industrial revolution. We can see here the mills, the factories that really started the technology boom that we're now appreciating today as Industry 4.0. The reason this is here, this was the very first piece of health and safety legislation in the world, the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, 1802, put in place by the gentleman there, eventually Sir Robert Peel, who also invented the British police force. So that's an interesting, quirky fact for you there. But what this does is, as you can see, the word safety doesn't really appear, and it didn't. Generally, this was about people working after child labour. You can see the lass up there on the screen. Her job was to pick up all the little bits of cotton that fell under the machines. And the idea of this piece of legislation was to prevent children working more than 12 hours a day, to give them some ventilation, always nice, isn't it, to be able to breathe, to give them a basic education. And through their morals, it was also time off to go to church on a Sunday morning, but nothing to do with safety. Because safety at this particular point in time is not something that was considered to be anything. With the technological revolutions, accidents that occurred were simply thought to be acts of God, that this was inevitable within the technological changes we were bringing in. And I want you to hang on to that until I get to the end of my bit as well, because we're seeing a new technological revolution that, again, is perhaps bringing different problems and issues into the industrial landscape. But the point of this piece of legislation, and you can see there our first parliament still looks like that, but basically the MPs and the people that made legislation at this time were the same people that ran the factories. They were the people with all the money. And as a result, if you start putting health and safety legislation in, things might slow down a little bit. And there were some wonderful arguments at this time, like the Belgian lace makers will take over, or we'll lose out our productivity. But these are not justifiable arguments when people are getting injured and killed for no fault of their own, simply through poor occupational health safety management. So this legislation was very hard won. People fought for this, people protested, and people died to get these changes enacted within industrial settings. This was something we did as a people. It came from the ground up, and it was important to make these changes and to make a start on actually challenging how people were being put to work. And that continues today, but I do never forget that this was hard-won legislation. But then we find that obviously, and I'm trying to take you sort of historically through here about, yes, 100, nearly 200 years, although much of this happens in the last sort of couple of decades. So in terms of safety, there has been an enormous amount of developments. Historically, mechanical controls. The very first piece of actual safety-related legislation was about machine guarding in the UK, and we still see that today, because as you can see, that's whizzed its way up to the idea of direct and indirect controls for safety within construction work sites. We also obviously had a growing interest in people, in behaviour-based safety, and unsafe acts. The workers carrying out unsafe acts, whether you think that's their own volition, if we want to go to reasons, forced and unenforced errors, for example, and that fed into safety culture, which is how you do what you do, which is still a fascinating topic. I've recently just started a project on that with the CSRA now. Not another survey, you'll be pleased to know, but different ways of looking around corners to see how we can actually establish and determine what safety culture is, but using mechanisms that don't directly have to rely on evidence from the workers, more how they actually really experience things, not just in the 5 minutes they're filling in a safety culture survey. And obviously that has led to psychological safety, the feeling of workers being comfortable to actually raise issues. And then we saw the ideas around systemic safety, around complexity within occupational safety management, which has led to ideas around energy-based safety, where we've actually looking at what energy is uncontrolled within the construction workplace and how we are then able to change perhaps what we do in order to deliver that. So there's been an awful lot of different things coming in, and now we obviously also have things like safety 2, safety differently, HOP, another human-focused, behavioural-focused theory that actually pulls back and says, well, these unsafe acts, frankly, are not really the fault of the worker. And having my time on construction, 10 years, I know it was procurement, it was commercial pressures, it was time pressures, and these things all make people forced to have to make mistakes or to make workarounds. So it's very, very complicated, and this is why I love researching in this particular space. It's got all the things going on. There are no simple answers, because if there were, we wouldn't still, unfortunately, have the fatality rates within construction that we do. Just want to touch on the idea of measuring things, which people love. I'm really bad at measuring things. So I'm very much a social scientist, but we've gone from lagging indicators, and you can see here Heinrich's triangle, that even Heinrich said this is not causality. Yet we still see people in the field trying to grab as many near misses as they can in the hope that that will prevent that fatality. But this isn't linear. Heinrich argued that his model should not be used in this way, yet it still endures. We've also got things around TRIR, which the CSRA, before I joined it, obviously I wasn't involved in this because I can barely add 2 and 2, but TRIR as a statistical measure of safety within organizations is just frankly statistically invalid. There were 3.2 trillion hours of worker data went into the analyses that demonstrated this. The fact that it's very skewed towards big organizations, it's very unfair to small organizations. So we have an awful lot of the idea of using maths to look at people. People aren't steel beams, they're not concrete. They don't always do what you want them to. They are awkward and annoying and sometimes just make mistakes and get confused. And I've lived that, I know that. Come on in, guys. So we shouldn't be having near miss day, frankly, if you want my opinion, because these numbers, stats don't work like that. We're moving on to more leading indicators. And again, things like supervisor inspections, but again, quantifying these, not necessarily the best idea, because it's the quality that matters. And again, the CSRA has some resources to try and apply a quality metric, because just because you've done 25 inspections that week is not actually that much of a leading indicator in terms of how your safety performance will go forwards, other than perhaps giving you some sort of counts. If the quality of those inspections is poor, then you're not really going to get anything out of that. And obviously, I've just mentioned here drug and alcohol testing as marijuana becomes legalized for personal use across the US and various other countries, Portugal, other countries across the world. Using that as a metric for leading indicators, again, perhaps not the most valid. I've done some research on that myself. And what it can do, unfortunately, is you need to be fair with your testing. We need to make sure that those in the office suffer the same fate as those on the site. And the other problem that it actually brings is the way marijuana is tested. It's a historic test, not an impairment test. So unfortunately, you have something on a Friday and you'll still test hot Monday. And what this is actually doing is asking construction workers to take harder drugs because they don't come up in the drug test. So that's not really helping anybody's well-being. And as a result is really quite socially interesting as well from a cultural perspective, what is acceptable, what is sanctioned, what is not, and how we implement that in the field of construction, where we certainly need people to be at the top of their game when working in high hazard environments that do lack direct control. We also have problems with occupational health, of course. Here's one of my old students, John Berry, showing me how you do bricklaying, or block laying rather. But we have an enormous amount of problems in the fact that the work that we often do in construction is done the same way as it was developed in those very first photos that I showed you. We've been doing things the same way for 100 years. And then we're finding out that this is really not good for the people that have to do these activities. We have very high levels of musculoskeletal disorders. People get tired, people stop working. I know for a fact when I was on site, it was normally my lower back that wasn't my friend. And then as soon as I started, became an academic and was sat behind a computer, oh, didn't my shoulders hate me for that one? So it's interesting that we kind of relate these to heavy, hard work. But I think I've probably suffered more as an academic from going like this over screens and papers than I ever did on a building site where I had beautiful long distance vision in front of me and my head was held high. Anyway, we've also got problems of dermatitis, some of the materials that we use. Dust is a big problem in terms of pulmonary disorders, in terms of breathing issues. It's not the sexiest thing in the world, dust. So, but it is super important in terms of the damage we've done. And I've included a picture here of nano. Now, there was some research done by Alistair Gibb and the guys at Loughborough around nano materials. They're on nearly an enormous amount of construction products that we don't necessarily know. And part of the problem with nano is we don't know its long-term effects on the lungs. And when you look at it under certain microscopes, it looks rather like asbestos. So perhaps we should be thinking about, before we do these sort of self-cleaning cladding, self-cleaning glass, an enormous amount of construction products are nano coated. And we are letting people drill into them, to cut them, to use them, that may well bring us problems down the line. So there are always things we need to keep aware of, keep ahead of, examine, and test and scientifically examine properly. More recently, we've had some really shocking new statistics around well-being and mental health in the industry. This is something Billy does a lot of research about. And we're also running a project at the CSRA at the minute in conjunction with CII, looking at construction worker mental health. Construction workers statistically, unfortunately, keep killing themselves more often than any other industry. We need to unpack why, whether this is actually construction's fault, or whether we're looking at a Venn diagram overlap of people who are finding life harder right now is also a question to be asked. But we also need to be mindful that many things that are put in place, mindfulness, support, it's a lot easier to arrange for those that have colours are white than blue. You can't necessarily give the crane worker a day off because he feels like it, and that's taken a day off your production. We need to think more intelligently and cleverly how we will support workers in terms of their mental health and well-being in a way that doesn't make a nonsense of how they are actually put to work in the first place. It's a lot easier to do this kind of thing in offices, but we need to remember that most construction projects are not built by the people whose names are on the hoardings. They are built by subcontractors. They are built by sole traders. They are built by the people that get their hands dirty. And those are the people who are actually most vulnerable to these problems at the moment. So we need to make sure that we're not doing tokenistic efforts and inviting people to certain events without thinking meaningfully about what it is we're doing. The latest thing in construction safety is Industry 4.0. See how I got us there? I ignored 2 and 3, by the way. But so the digitization, come on in. The digitization of construction as an industry as a whole has been warmly welcomed, simply because we're always getting in trouble for our productivity, for all the other bits and bobs. And technology is going to save us by all accounts. So we've got different things here. We have the idea of using drones rather than putting people in vulnerable places to survey. We've got exoskeletons, as you can see there, to make people able to protect their muscular MSD, to minimize MSDs, and to protect the work that they do. The one that kind of worries me, and I won't try and hide that, because all you've got to do is Google and you can find out the things I've written about this. But it can be also problematic. Again, we need to make sure we're not turning workers simply into robots studded with different sensors. And certainly the possibility for the digital exhaust, which is all the side data that's being collected, quite a subject of interest at the minute with what's happening with TikTok and the like. But this digital exhaust that all your apps will be collecting on you is what that can be used for, because there was obviously the potential for that to be used to monitor productivity. But then when we add AI into that cocktail, can AI tell whether the conversation a worker is having stood still is meaningful and productive for the work site, or are they talking about the basketball results? I did promise I wouldn't do that, Mark, but I will. So you can't, but an AI can't tell that. An AI does not know. So are we actually setting ourselves up for future issues that could arise by incremental acceptance of things that we haven't perhaps thought of the unintended consequences? And this is kind of where my position is, because the British government are not known for their reluctance to adopt tech. In fact, they love it. All the research funding around construction safety at the minute in the UK, even construction itself, all has to be on a technological basis, which is why I never win any money, by the way. That's why I had to come and find this job. But even the UK government has clearly stated that constant surveillance is bad for your health. The fact that we're all surveilled now, as long as you've got one of these in your pocket, you are being surveilled, of course. Whether someone's actively looking or cares or not, we are. But when we start putting sensors on workers, yes, it may be so they don't have collisions with machines. It may be so that we can monitor what they're doing. But that isn't all it can do. And we need to be mindful of that very much. And I'll share why in a moment, because the construction industry isn't the most trustworthy all the time. And I know I used to work in it, by the way. I'm allowed to say that. So surveillance, we need to think about what we're doing. And this is something that CIB W099 is certainly looking at. Our next conference this summer is about digital safety. So we have a whole large amount of interest in this, but we need to not be rushing to something that could perhaps better be solved by how we structure the work, what work we're actually doing. And let's think a little bit more reflectively about this, perhaps. But we're also very, very keen to take a global perspective in CIB, because you can have all the Internet of Things, sensor-enabled technology. You live in a country with load shedding. That's not going to go very well, is it? So we also very much are aware of the fact that construction is a global industry. CIB 99 is a global organization. And we also really need to support and help colleagues across the world for the greater good of construction workers. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we impose what the West has come up with as a great idea. To quote Noam Chomsky, we can hardly point to this model of development with any pride, given where we are right now. So it's important that this isn't simply a transplanting of things. The UK, many countries use a version of UK legislation. And I actually did some work with my close colleague, Emmanuel Aboaje-Nimo, looking at this particular situation. Ghana is a country that obviously post-colonial, ex-colonial, we should never have been there. But anyway, but now it's still trying to operate on UK safety rules. But the cultures are, this isn't sensible. This isn't the way to do it, because they don't work that well in the UK, by the way. I started working in construction, and I'm old enough to have known when 2 people died a week in the UK on building sites when I started. My mother was thrilled by my choice of career, as you can imagine. But there is work to be done around this to actually start creating meaningful ways of supporting workers having to work in unhealthy, unsafe conditions. Obviously, the work Amnesty International did around FIFA and Qatar, where an enormous number of migrant workers were exploited, frankly, and there were an enormous amount of casualties from those particular projects. It's really something that we as a group are very keen to address and to manage better. So we have certainly in the terms of the occupational safety, of the construction techniques being used, of the labour organisation. So you can see here some workers in the middle of the slide. These guys are in South Africa. And this was a project I did with colleagues down there, Prof. E and Lesiba Molo, and we looked at this work to see how workers were actually being introduced into the industry. Ironically, it turned out that casual work for construction, which is not very healthy work, it doesn't enable you to have regular wages, it doesn't enable you necessarily to have consistency in your life, comfort, that mental well-being. And workers here, they turn up, they may get work that day, they may not. And it was interesting that what we actually found was in the UK, the same thing happens. People are just sat in their kitchen waiting for the text. They're not stood on the roadside. But we still have this problem around construction labour, that its value of the work that these people do is perhaps not as valorised as it ought to be, frankly. And very much I'm happy to say that W099 hopes to be at Knust in Ghana in 2 years' time. We're actually going there for our conference in the hope that we can really add some energy and support to colleagues working in that country. But we ought to not rest on our laurels, because everything isn't perfect and happy and rosy everywhere else. We have problems, certainly in the UK. So you'll see these basement photos. We have a big problem with modern slavery for construction workers in the UK. They're brought over often from Eastern Europe. And these basements are under, you know, those big fancy houses you see in London? Yeah, they all go down about 5 stories. People put in swimming pools, cinemas, all the fancy stuff, living the life of luxury that you see on TikTok. Unfortunately, someone's got to build it. And people have pulled people out of basements working where they've got generators, there is no ventilation. These people are just underground. This is really poor practice. And people recently have been put in jail for this. And this happens on quite a regular basis. Construction, we often think of modern slavery as either sex trafficking or other things. Construction has this as a problem, by the way. It's not dissimilar to the way things were working, unfortunately, early on in Qatar, where people were effectively modern slaves to build those particular stadia. And then the other side of this slide is another interesting fact, and this is why we do not need to rest on our laurels. There was a big problem in the UK where construction workers were blacklisted. They weren't allowed to work on sites. They turn up and be told the next day, the job's not here anymore. Away you go. This was happening since the 70s, 1970s. And the problem was many of these workers had raised health and safety issues. That was a really easy way to get yourself on this list. And as a result, they weren't allowed to work anymore. They were seen as troublemakers. And even perhaps worse, the Metropolitan Police in London spent a good 10 years denying they had anything to do with this. And then, oh dear, they had to admit they did. So the police were actively providing information on these people to an organisation. And the people that were using this list were big contractors. They were big, well-known UK contractors, and they have paid out, I think, millions. I think it's about 75 million in compensation as a result of this. It's starting to come to the end of going through courts now. But over 3,000 workers affected, and many of them on the list for problems like this. Hence, with all that drama, this is our slogan. This is our slogan for W099, remember the dead, but fight like hell for the living. And we try and do that. We try and do that for construction workers across the world. In developing countries, as we grow as a human global community, but we're not resting on our laurels because there are many other practices that still need some energy. And this is Mother Jones who made this original statement back in the day. She actually worked in the mining industry. She was a union coordinator. She was an absolutely awesome woman. And we've adopted her words as an inspiration to W099 and her rallying cry for workers across the world. So how does 99 fit into this? So obviously you've got Billy and myself as our current coordinators, but back when I was still doing my A-levels in the UK, this was the very first conference. Back in 1994, the annual RINCA conference happened. I have to give a shout out to the guy dressed like John Travolta, who is, of course, Professor John Smallwood, the legend that is. And this is his photo that I've pinched. So John, if you're on the line, I'm sorry. But you can see him sat next to Alistair Gibb there at the very, very first one, held in Florida, USA, back in '94. And from there, CIB 99 has continued to go from strength to strength. We are one of the commissions able to hold an annual conference, and we truly are international. These are all the delegates that dialed in during COVID to Glasgow, and you can see we have got every continent except Antarctica. So we're pretty proud of that. We are an international organization. We are very, very concerned. It's a global problem, and people have their own different issues in different places and times, but we work collaboratively to try and share, collate, support people in developing solutions to the problems they find within their particular environment. We're also not very good at being normal. You can see there myself and Billy blending in with everyone in grey suits on the stage. And we actually won Best Coordinator Award, along with our brother from another mother, Profi Fidelis Emuse, who runs W123. Fidelis, welcome if you are here. But the three of us were honoured to be awarded. Mark, there you are, looking dapper as ever in the left-hand corner of that picture, by the way. But the reason we won is because of our global community. And this was a conference we held in Salvador in Brazil, another place in the world. I don't think my mother was that keen I went, but it was what a wonderful place, what a wonderful city, what a wonderful country, absolutely magic. And you can see there the breadth and excitement of all the folks that made it there to enjoy, share information, learn more, disseminate their research, support our PhD students, develop the next generation of safety academics within our field. We had an absolutely a wonderful time there, and it's a very, very close community, as you can see. Even in COVID, where conferences got very boring, we were still able to join up, meet, and share with our colleagues. So on that note, that was the world's fastest review of occupational health, safety and construction, by the way. I'm going to pass to Billy, who's going to talk us through some of our research highlights, to share with you some of the research that's come out of W099. Billy, I'm going to be your glamorous assistant with the clicker. If you want to take over now, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for that that lovely introduction to the research highlights, which I'm going to go through. Now, at W099, we have several decades of research we could have chose for this presentation today, but we decided that we would take the opportunity to honour a stalwart, the late Professor Jimmy Hinsey, who sadly passed away in 2013. And he was one of the earlier coordinators of W099. Quite a few folk on the online call will know and fondly remember Jimmy. And as a consequence of that, we, after 2013, we announced an award in Jimmy's name for the best conference paper at our W099, which has morphed into W099, W123 conferences with our sister commission on people in construction. To put this into context, Jimmy Hinsey in the CIB coordinator chronology is probably Fred and my grandfather in terms of the coordinators that have gone before. And to give you an idea of the level of Jimmy's influence, I remember we attended the conference in Beijing, China, and Jimmy only just took to the stage and got a standing ovation. That's how highly Jimmy was thought of. And this is the reason why we now have this from 2014 onwards, the Jimmy Hinsey Best Safety, Health, Wellbeing paper. And I'm going to talk you through the winners of that and just give you a little highlight of these winners over the next 10-15 minutes or so. Next slide, please, Fred. So the first winner, believe it or not, of the Jimmy Hinsey Award in 2014, where the conference was in the city of Lund in Sweden, was David Oswald, Fred Sherratt, the one and only, and Simon Smith for their paper on thought consistency questions in safety climate surveys, a case study example. Now, I must say this is long before Fred and I became the joint coordinators of W099, so there's no there's no insinuation that she somehow got this through her position. The paper itself focuses on something called safety climate surveys, which Fred alluded to in the measurement piece there earlier on. And this paper reviewed just how good are the questions and the questionnaires to assess safety climate, which is essentially the perception of the safety climate. She focused predominantly, or the team focused on these types of questions known as thought consistency, where the same question is asked several times to try and identify if a true response is received from the respondents. The study found that personalized questions, so questions that relate to the individual themselves, such as my safety matters more than money to my employer, where the focus is on the individual answering the questions, these tended to result in answers quite different if the question was phrased in a more general matter. And that's important for this type of metric. And Fred loves to get, have a critique of things that measure and ask if it's really quantitative as an appropriate method for measuring health and safety. Also the importance of language and the words used. So sometimes if an overcritical word is used, that can influence the result compared to a more neutral word in the questionnaire. The particular questionnaires that were surveyed by Fred et al. Included 128 questions, which is already far too much. And they found that of those, only 44 were really needed, which raises the question why you should ask so many superfluous questions in the name of measuring health and safety performance. Nonetheless, she did have to admit that the questionnaires did have some form of predictive validity. Fred, if you just click the next item on the slide for me, what that's showing from the paper is that where the questionnaire, the climate survey, showed that there was a problem within a particular department around the workers that were surveyed in this piece of research. The department which accounted for about 35% of all respondents is the one on the right-hand side of the column, which subsequently showed a higher level of accidents and incidents 6 months down the line. So it did show in some respect that climate questionnaires do have some level of validity. But as Fred explained earlier on in the presentation today, that not even the number of accidents can be trusted as a valid measure of your safety performance. So this paper, along with all the others I'm going to summarize today, are freely available through the ICONDA website. And to be honest, if you just Google the title of the paper, you will find it through Google Scholar. So that's the paper from 2014. Next slide, please, Fred. In 2015, in Belfast, UK, Jane English and Sian Abrams won the best paper for their research paper on HIV/AIDS in South Africa. And this shows, one, the international element that Fred alluded to in our group, but also something that we in the Northern Hemisphere don't quite get a handle on, and that is the AIDS and HIV is an issue for construction, for peripatetic construction workers, particularly in African nations in this part of the world. This particular paper was basically a qualitative paper involving workshops with students of construction to ascertain their knowledge and understanding of the issues around HIV/AIDS and whether interventions could.
You might want to tell him, he might be able to hear you.
Okay. Billy, if you can hear me, we've lost your audio. Are you still there? We have lost you. Are you still on the Zoom?
Fred, no, he's not. He's not on the Zoom. I imagine that his machine has crashed in some way and he'll be reconnecting.
Don, you're absolutely right. Oh,
Yeah.
you missed it, Meg. All right, Billy, get back on here as soon as you can, love. All right, see you. I think we probably need to jump to the next one, which unfortunately is equally nepotistic. All right then, mate. See you in a minute. Guilty taking over. Yes. No, he should be back in a second. Because I don't know this one, you see. Yeah, actually, go with that. Go with that. Billy, let us know when you're back, love. And in the meantime, we'll do some Q&A.
As you can imagine, in this today's world, we are likely to have some discontinuity with our technology. So that's what we are facing. Professor Billy here is trying to log in again. As we understand, he probably lost his connection or crashed his computer. I don't know. But we have Professor Fred Sherratt here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into some questions. And while Professor Hare is logging back in, we can have some good conversation going on. So anybody with questions for Professor Sherratt? Yes, Professor Abraham.
Robert Peel was the Prime Minister. Wasn't one of the Peels a Prime Minister as well in the UK?
I stopped learning history when I was 13, so
okay.
I have absolutely no idea. I know he invented the police. He was a very prominent MP.
MP, okay.
Yes. So
I think he was pretty active in Queen Victoria's.
Yes, he was certainly around the 18th. Yes, he certainly was. He was actually from where I lived for a long time, my husband's hometown of Bury. We have a big statue of him.
Oh, okay.
In the square.
So the question I had was, you spent extensive time in construction in the UK, and now you're working very closely with 80+ companies in the United States in the area of safety. What do you notice as the similarities and the differences in OSH across the UK and here?
Very good question. So interestingly, I think that perhaps it's due to sort of size and scalability. I think it's certainly in the UK, we are incredibly conscientious about a lot of on the ground stuff. So I think there is a big difference in terms of the social attitudes to personal responsibility have been very interesting. So for example, in the UK, we would be incredibly rigorous on quite large sites. So I'm talking big projects now. So there would probably, I would expect to see probably more emphasis on kind of walkways and management of that. Whereas in the US, I think you kind of approach things a bit differently in terms of site management, for example, in terms of investment in all these kind of extra things. However, that said, I think it's very interesting. The biggest difference I noticed, and kind of in part the reason that I moved here, was because there is much more support and acknowledgement of the good work that the construction workers do, if you get me. So in the UK, there is an enormous amount of urge to actually stop people being on site. They'd actually want it all done by robots in factories. It doesn't get any kind of value. Whereas here in the US, the fact that it's a job role that can be a good job, it can be a union job, it can be a job where somebody can work and support a family in a decent way. And that still holds value. And I actually really appreciate that. I enjoy that a lot. So in terms of supporting how that falls out in terms of occupational health and safety is quite interesting, because I think more in the UK, we are trying to develop ways of getting people out of the process. If people are going to have accidents, let's get rid of them. But the problem is that does not have any long-term view on maintaining a healthy society for the poor people that end up in construction because maybe they're dyslexic, maybe they didn't do so good at school. All these people that still have so much to contribute and are worthwhile. There's going to come a day when we're going to run out of people that can put two bits of wood together in a way that they don't fall apart, rather than just people that work on computers. So I think in terms of how that's going, but we're more about, certainly here in the US, I see more about keeping the workers involved, but enhancing the processes to make them safer. And I think that's quite it's a very high level philosophical difference, but I think it's one that certainly is noticeable for myself in terms of moving here. Is he back? Ah, brilliant. Thank you for your question, lovely.
Your professor here is back, so we'll hand it over back to him. Billy, please go ahead.
Hi guys, I was talking to myself for quite some time before I realized I wasn't there. I'll pick up. Where do you want me to pick up, Fred?
Let's jump to the next one, I think, because
go ahead.
Just nature of time.
Sure. I'll pick up the pace as soon as I can see the slides. Okay, this one's by a really good team. Kenneth Lawani, Billy Hare, and Ian Cameron from Glasgow, UK. Again, it was after this conference in Cape Town, South Africa, that Fred and myself were made joint coordinators. So I can only assume that our excellent paper writing put us in prime position to be appointed as the coordinators of W099. This particular paper is on something that we call in the UK worker engagement. So engaging your workers in health and safety in order to improve health and safety performance. And this was part of work to create a maturity model, but rather than an organizational maturity model, it's a model from the perspective of the individual. And it has 5 elements to it. Meaningful discussion, such as if you ask a worker on a construction site, what do they have to say about safety and health? What you find is it's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The first thing that they tend to want to talk about is the welfare facilities, the toilets or the bathrooms, as you might say in the US. After you satisfy those needs, the next thing that they want to discuss are identifying, hazard spotting, and how they can be put right. And what you find is that the more you talk to them, and as long as you sort the problems, it escalates to higher level discussions. And that might eventually lead to things such as policy decisions, management decisions, of which the workers themselves have a really good insight as to how they can improve matters. On the wheel that we've developed here, you can see trust is another element. That's really fascinating. Trust in the ability of your supervisor. If you think they're incompetent, you won't trust them. Trust if they have genuine benevolence. If your perception is they do not genuinely want to keep you safe, you'll lose your trust. And finally, trust in terms of integrity. Are you treated in the same way as everyone else? Or are some people treated as favorites and others? Is it dependent on the color of your skin, for example? All these things can impact on trust. And if you lose that, then you won't get genuine worker engagement. The commitment is whether you have a commitment, whether you're being watched. So that's in relation to if you're being observed, you'll be compliant in terms of safety behavior. And if you're not being watched, you're not as safe. So that's a lack of commitment. Then you might have something called compliance commitment. You do what is required and nothing more. And the final one, very US orientated in the terminology, citizenship commitment. In other words, you will not walk past an issue, you will deal with it. The other items that I'll skip over for now are empowerment, which is around you're empowered to impact on decision making, and motivation, the classic motivation factors moving from extrinsic to intrinsic. And taken together, there's a lot of overlap between these various factors. But what we developed is a method of not quantitatively measuring, but qualitatively measuring the quality of your worker engagement to improve how and why your workers and what they discuss when they engage with you on health and safety. I'll move to the next winning paper, Fred.
Nothing about the penguins, Billy.
There's the penguins. Believe it or not, South Africa has penguins, and there's the proof to show it.
Anna made us get the train there, so that was quite fun.
Thanks, Fred. 2018 was Salvador, Brazil. Fred had showed you the photographs from that particular conference. And the winners were from Brazil, Rosina Rodrigues Santos and De Mello and Dana Bastos Costa for their paper on what they call, they have a special word, unmanned aerial systems, more plainly known as drone technology. Now, as you saw earlier, Fred has some reservations about technology in general. However, the purpose of this paper was to review how the drone technology can be used for monitoring and improving health and safety and developing a protocol for that. It's interesting because in this context, it created a mechanism to identify where, for example, production or what the managers thought would be adequate production was overestimated, and the drones identified the reasons why that was in terms of lack of planning and separation of different functions within the management organization, which defeated the production levels they were hoping for. But however, in so doing, also found that an absence of planning to help, which also impacts on production, also led to absence in safety measures, such as what we call here edge protection. There are some images from the drones that Fred will bring up now with a click of the button. And what we see here, it might be a little grainy on your image there, but there's about 8 images. Image A is where workers have been noticed to be improvising in terms of creating ad hoc temporary works around excavations, which was in a haphazard way due to a lack of planning from management. Photo B shows again excavation areas where there's a lack of edge protection. Image B has a large excavation with water in it, which is referred to in the paper as a cesspool where workers can fall in. Image C is a ladder that's being used. So that's image D, is the ladder being used inappropriate. C is the unloading of materials unsafely. Some of these immediately look like behavior issues, but again, due to, in most cases, lack of planning from a management perspective. In the interest of time, I won't go through all these images, but you get the idea. And then that was able to identify and calculate a pie chart and measurements of the most common safety items that the drone technology identified. So that was the winning paper in 2018. Next paper, Fred. 2020 in Glasgow, which was online, Mi Yun Ling and Khurshid Hamed for their paper on mindfulness-based stress reduction workshops to reduce stress and coping behaviours amongst construction professionals. This shows you the quite broad nature of the research we see at our W099 conferences. You know, at one end of the spectrum, you've got technology, you've got management, and then you've got more social type aspects around people and people management. This particular study focused again on cases of intervention studies using something called mindfulness. Now, mindfulness gets sometimes a bad rap for being a little bit airy-fairy. This particular version here is what you might call the scientific approach to mindfulness that's been proved through psychological experiments. I think I need a click, Fred, to bring up the items. What this showed that these things, because it's an international conference and the papers are published in English, some of the phrases here might seem a bit odd. It's the translation from Chinese or Mandarin to English. But these are improvements that the intervention showed in terms of mindfulness techniques. And the really interesting thing is the next point on the slide, Fred, is that it reduced, now these are self-administered questionnaires as to monitoring yourself in terms of the outcomes of the mindfulness training. So it reduced states of yawning, becoming drowsy, and heart rate, high heart rate, less episodes of that as a result of the mindfulness techniques. So again, the paper is available online if you find that interesting. I think we're on, the next one is the last one, Fred. I might be wrong, but this might be the last one. Again, Glasgow online. We had 2 attempts to run the conference in Glasgow and COVID persisted, so we had to have 2 online conferences. This particular paper is what we call a systematic literature review. And this winning paper from Mustafa Neiman, Mohammed Khalid and Mike Beam from the US revisited the UAVs or the drone technology, but had a look at the ethical considerations and the issues around that, which again made for interesting reading. Things like, can drones collide with workers and other objects? They were not able to find concrete examples of this from accident reports, but I dare say that might be because they could be hiding those or they're not properly reported. The main issues are around surveillance and privacy risk. So the issue there is, do you feel stressed at being constantly monitored, Big Brother watching you? The ethics deficit referred to here in the paper is whether, are there any guidelines in terms of ethical use of drones? I know that in the UK, we have under the Data Protection Act and Data Protection Regulation does reference things like this these days in more recent times, but worldwide, there's not very much on that. The potential for abuse in the paper discusses things how workers can be threatened with things that have been identified through the drone that's not even work related, and that's obviously examples of abuse. The potential for what I've called here trespassing. So the drone camera picking up images that are outside the site perimeter, and that being a problem for data protection and being able to see things that and storing that data is a problem as well. So as Fred said at the beginning, technology has its downsides as well as its upsides. And this paper discusses that with lots of really useful references from the literature review that if you're interested in that particular subject is worth reading. That concludes, I think, is that the last one, Fred? If you go to the
certainly is, love.
And it's just to reiterate what Mark had said at the beginning of this event, that we are celebrating at CIB the 70 years of cooperation. We are developing a number of things to mark this celebration. There's various web recordings being made as we speak. There will be a commemorative publication looking back and looking forward. And there's other things happening as well. And we will be marking this at every CIB event. So I think this is one of the first to mark it as an event, and throughout the whole calendar year, you will see more events and more initiatives in relation to marking the 70 years of CIB. Fred, I think I'm handing back to you now to wind things.
Certainly are. I think, yes, we are a little touch over time, but thank you all so very much. And are there any more questions? Thank you.
Well, thank you indeed. That was such a wonderful presentation. And we are really privileged to have two distinguished academics being able to make their presentation, their research, and their involvement with safety and well-being to all of us. So indeed, we are privileged. Thank you, Billy. Thank you for logging in and re-logging in, and thanks, Fred. It's such an honor. Fred, we are able to bring her here. She's in Colorado, so it's easier for us to get her here. But glad, Billy, that you could join in as well. So let me open for questions. I'm sure we'll have to coordinate how I handle questions from the online audience and physical audience here. So let's start our group here. Yes, please, go ahead.
I have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Dr. Fred and Professor Billy, for the awesome presentations. My first question is basically to ask about, we talked about near misses are not oftentimes a good valid indicators of safety performance. So I wanted to ask, like, what are some of the best indicators for safety performance on a job site? So that's like the first question. The second question I want to ask is, you mentioned something about, for example, nanoparticles and materials are some of the new things that were probably not looked at for initially as safety concerns. So my question is, looking at the improvement and the new technologies coming into the construction industry, how can a job site absorb new concerns for safety on the job site?
Okay, I'll answer your last one first, because you give me two questions and I'm quite old. So I've probably forgotten the first one by now already. However, but with regard to the nano, I think it's more of a responsibility on the manufacturers to ensure that what they are creating is actually appropriately considered from all perspectives. It's quite a tricky one. It's not going to be the main contractors, but we're looking at things like industry bodies, chartered professional bodies, things like the ASSP, things like that, where there are construction specific elements that can take on that type of research, and perhaps most importantly, fund it, because you can't explore things in laboratories for free. So you have to really consider who is going to actually fund this work. And by rights, it should be the manufacturers. However, we've all too recently, unfortunately, seen that that doesn't always work. You may have heard of the Grenfell Tower fire in London that killed 72 people. That was entirely down to manufacturers and their products, and not really quite telling the truth about them in terms of what they're doing. So collectively, that is a very interesting question about where ownership and responsibility for that lies. And I think it's on the industry as a whole, and organizations like CIB that span the globe are able to undertake perhaps and then disseminate this research to everybody, so that we're not in a situation where we have different values and different benchmark requirements within different parts of the world. So in terms of nano, there was some investment in some research, but to my knowledge, that is not continuing. And it may not be, unfortunately, until we get to the point where people start maybe getting sick, touch wood, I really hope they don't, from these kind of new materials being used so regularly. And it may be, perhaps as it was with asbestos, it's when you start doing maintenance on those buildings that the problems happen. Not necessarily if it's there and it's in place and it's never touched. Things are normally okay with things that create tiny particles, as asbestos did. It's a great product, just don't drill a hole in it or don't mess with it. Same thing might be the case, so we'll see that as that goes. So your first question was about what indicators should we use? Oh, if I had the answer to that, I would be an enormous amount richer, and actually also if I had any interest in making lots of money, which I don't really. So I think for that point of view, it's going to be a combination of things. I mean, fundamentally, accident rates are important. They shouldn't be used in the way they are. But for an individual company or an individual job site, you can actually start to see how that goes. There are a plethora of leading indicators, the amount of surveys, things like that people are doing, the meaningful engagement of the workforce. The thing that I find quite interesting is most construction professionals can walk on a job site and tell you if it's safe or not. You can just feel it. You just know. And in part, it's being able to distill that experiential knowledge, that way of just having the feels. And there's research done on that proves that strongly suggests, I should say, rather than proves, that strongly suggests that's an appropriate sort of, that works. But how you measure that is important. And actually, the project I've just started is looking at exactly that. is looking at exactly what is it we need to pull on so that we can actually make a sensible evaluation of safety culture, if we're going to have to call it that. Billy, do you want to add anything to my replies there?
That was an extensive reply. I'll just add on the measurement question that yes, leading is perceived wisdom. Leading metrics are preferred to lagging metrics for obvious reasons, that they can be predictive. I would just some words of caution. There's been work done by Helen Lingard in Australia, which shows that what we think are leading indicators can become lagging. And what I mean by that is that immediately after an accident, all of a sudden the number of leading measures such as site inspections increase, the number of near miss reports increase as a reaction to the accident, and that's not particularly helpful, and then they tail off again sometime later. I would also mention the book of a UK author by the name of Townsend, and the book is called Safety Can't Be Measured, which speaks to what you just said, Fred. So
yeah, it's one of my favorites, that, Billy, obviously.
Well, do we have, yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so thanks so much for your presentation. As a person who is also, whose research is also construction safety area, I want to ask one question. So for the safety research, since this is highly related to the worker's life, it is important to have some practical impact. But I think in construction industry, there's some barrier which is about we often fail to translate academic finding into the practice, which means that academic findings sometimes often just stay in the academia. Yeah. So are there any strategy or some suggestion that we can promote the translation of the academic finding into practice so that we can broaden the impact of our research? That's
probably a great question for everyone in the room. So I think what's important, in fact, no, Billy, do you want to go first? Because I can talk for England, love, so you go first, and then I will.
Yeah. In the UK, we're always relating it to what happens in the UK. We try to preach not to start that way, but it's our main point of reference, I guess. And that is we talk about research impact. And this is a good move. This is a recent move in terms of academic endeavour in the UK and around the world, is that you can no longer, for most universities, just do research for research's sake. It has to have impact on society and impact on industry for what we do. So we now, without a doubt, any research we do, we have to think about how that research is going to be disseminated, communicated to industry, and what impact it's going to have. And I do this now more than I've ever done before, as I spend so much time at events just like this, speaking to the industry, telling them what findings of research we have and how that can help them. Whether it works, we're just at the mercy of whether the people who make the decisions. But also doing this is an excellent example, because we are now getting our research into teaching and into the student body. You are the future of, I sound like a Michael Jackson song, of our industry. And if we can get you now and give you our findings and implore the importance of the work that we do, then this means that hopefully when the next time I put something out on LinkedIn and you're linked up to our LinkedIn and I say, here's some new research, that you think wise enough to adopt it and take it with you. Some countries are better than others at acknowledging academics. In the UK, I don't know to what extent in the US, being a professor and talking to construction industry doesn't exactly win you any friends or create your credibility. So there's a little bit of a barrier there that we have to bring down, and we have to present ourselves as credible individuals. So that's on us to do that, Fred.
Yeah, I think great points, Billy. And I would only add to that how we disseminate our research is kind of important. So you need that journal paper, because that is the peer review, that's your credibility. But think about writing a piece for something like Engineering News Record, for Professional Safety Journal. Think about how else can you actually share this to get it out there. And if you would like my top tip, come up with a catchy name. the day I wrote the zero paradox was probably the most successful because it sounds cool and everyone wants to know about it. Great. So it gives you an in, it gives you a way of doing that. I think in part, industry is busy building stuff. We need to actually start to perhaps take ownership of that a little more. But you're right, you can write 1 million academic papers read by about 12 people. Unfortunately, it's how to get that out there. But yes, really good point.
Well, we have a few minutes to take questions from online. Hold on one second. Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
I need to give our online audience. Yes, we have one.
Oh yeah.
Yes, go ahead, please, John.
Oh right, so that was put on the chat. Sorry, Billy, I did not know about the no slides. You could have rung me, dude.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't catch the no slide part earlier.
That's okay. It got sorted early on. That was okay. That was an old message.
Perfect, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect.
And Robert Peel was Prime Minister, thus evidencing why I don't have history GCSE. I never claimed to know anything about history, but thank you, Don, keeping it real. I can see John Gambatees with his paw up. Go for it, John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fred and Billy. Wonderful presentation. Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody there at Purdue as well. And a very good informative presentation. And I appreciate the depth of the research that's going on. It's very impressive. And I had one question, and perhaps this is for you, Fred. You are working now at CSRA, and 80 companies now, growing fast. And the benefit of the 80 companies is tremendous to be able to reach out to the companies, get data, develop the research, and make it very strong and robust. And I'm wondering if we can magnify that through CIB 99, where we have a global reach. Not just a US reach, but a global reach. And we can then grab more data and make the research more robust, if I may say so, using our connections around the world. And can CIB 99 start that or leverage that in some way?
I mean, I think that would be an absolutely fantastic idea. I think through the CSRA, my network here is I'm very, very blessed to have that, frankly. I know Billy is very well connected in the UK as well. And I'm sure we have members in different parts of the world who also are able to sort of create those networks and get people involved. I know Billy tried his very best when we were having virtual conferences that we didn't want to actually get much more industry involvement within the conference there. So Billy, I'll let you carry on with that.
Yeah, I've got a current pet hobby that I'm trying to push at the moment, and I'm hoping to recruit a PhD student on this particular international comparisons of, it catches the headlines, so it's the area to look at, I think, fatal accidents, because it's the acid test with it from country to country, and that's where John's idea of a global database or network would really help. Because, for example, take a country the size of the USA, your population is about 6 times the size of UK, I think. So UK's about 60 million, US about 300 million. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, roughly about right.
Yeah. So that's about 5 times the size, yeah? And the prevailing construction industry is also about 5 times the size. So therefore, 30 fatal accidents in the UK, if you multiply that by 5, that should be about 150 in the USA. And the number of fatal accidents in the UK is in fact about 1,000 per year. That's a tremendous disparity. And that's one of the comparisons of many that I really would like to investigate in more detail to ascertain why that might be the case.
Thanks, Billy. To go back to your point there, John, I think what we'll do is, certainly with these differences, these different ways, talking to the industry more will help us better understand these situations. So I think what I will take is, we'll put that on our agenda when we meet in Portugal. Are you coming?
Yeah. I am, yeah.
Can
I'll
put it
see
on
you
the
then.
agenda. And I think this is something we need to discuss within our W099 meeting and community. And we can certainly, I think that would be really a valuable thing we could try and add to our portfolio of being the best commission within CIB. Thank you, John.
So we have one more question from
Hubo,
Hubo Kai.
if you want to ask your question, I hope it's the one you put in the chat because I'm desperate to answer that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to listen through the great presentation and all the wonderful jobs that you all are doing at the CIB. I do have a question that's burning in my heart. In my recent journey, you know, again, following the other question in the room asking about transferring research, you know, into practical applications. So we can work on many technologies that we assume they can help workers towards their safety, towards their health. But I mean, and Billy mentioned earlier that, you know, as a professor working in this civil and construction engineering, workers probably don't share the same language as we do. So the question becomes, when you actually get a chance to interact with those workers, what's their perception of the directions that we are going? And also, do you see different perceptions or do you see different attitudes from the construction companies, right? Those business people.
Oh, that's the most beautiful question I've ever been asked. Thank you. Mainly because nobody really often asks them. Frankly, they're not important. The paper that I will be presenting in Porto actually speaks directly to this. So what I'm working on with my colleague Peter Wong from RMIT in Australia is how are we researching this in a way and for whose agenda? Because people are not asking construction workers particularly how they feel about this. If they are asking them, there are probably certain strings attached. Your supervisor comes up, says, are you happy wearing that sensor? What are you going to say? Oh, no, I don't like it. Or are you thinking you're going to lose your job if that's your response? So how are we asking the questions? Who are we asking the questions of? An enormous amount of research, particularly around wearable technologies, is actually carried out on students in laboratories. And then these findings are then used as a basis of people like it. Well, those are totally different people. We don't know if these things work in a field environment. The amount of field research about technology at the minute is incredibly small. Yet claims are being made that digitization is going to rescue construction safety. And it's something, as you can tell by how over the top I'm getting, this is something I feel incredibly passionate about. There are issues of privacy, ethics, all sorts of things. I used to work properly on job sites. I was a superintendent. I came into the office twice a day, once for lunch and once for a cup of tea in the afternoon. But I was out amongst these people, and that's why I do the work I do. I might be a professor now, but I can still talk site talk if needed, and I can swear with the best of them. But it's very interesting that I think as an academic community, we are not asking the right questions. And the paper title is actually, are we being useful idiots? Who are we serving here? The construction safety technology industry is worth a lot of money. Contractors love it. They can start monitoring all their workers. You can see where everybody is and what they're doing. I mean, what a magical thing to give to people. Anybody not productive, you can just sack them. Woohoo! Brilliant. All in the name of safety. I'm not prepared to stand by and let that happen. So I will continue to challenge it. Hubert, I'm glad I have somebody of a similar mindset in the room. Welcome. And I look forward to...
Yeah, thank you very much. Because I mean, my wife has been a construction engineer for like 7 years.
Yes.
And she worked on the job site. So usually that's, she's my very first step.
Awesome.
And I have some questions, you know, we'll be asking her and to see if that makes sense. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. But this is a really important topic that we do need to address before we just simply follow along with this technology is amazing narrative and this technological optimism and determinism. And I'm going to stop there because I could talk on that for hours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Hugo, for that interesting question. We are running short of time. We have exceeded actually our time. So in that interest, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question. So Yashu, please follow up later with your question if you don't mind. And my question is to Billy first, and then to Fred. Billy, you were talking about AI earlier, and my question to you was that, I hear a lot of talk about AI in the future being our co-pilot rather than, looking at autonomous vehicles. We're looking at more co-pilot as AI, our partners. In your opinion, does that add to the safety, or does that increase our safety concerns and well-being?
So is that AI, artificial intelligence?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is more of a personal view, and I've taken it through the research I've done on BIM technology and health and safety. I have a real concern around automating and having AI make decisions for designers, for example, around what you might call in the US prevention through design, what we in the UK safety in design. And I think you always have to have the human in control, and the human has to make the final decision, because as we can see with the chatbots, sorry, I don't know their particular acronym, it's far too long to remember for someone of my age. The problems there is that they are mimicking data on the World Wide Web, and that mimicking is I've read that some of the AI technology is behaving a bit like a stroppy kid having a bit of an upset moment, and that's a bit worrying, right? So just to reiterate, the human in control with the assistance of some form of AI so that they can make informed decisions is probably my personal preferred approach. The worry is that when we're using technology in our day-to-day life, it's so prolific and omnipresent that, just to touch back on one of the previous questions, the use of technology for safety and health. I've spoken to workers who are quite happy to wear wearable technology because they already wear Fitbits and similar technology. And to them, that they think that is a great addition to enhance their health and potentially their safety. But that will be, of course, up until the point where maybe a health impediment is identified with this technology, which results in them being sacked, which I'm not saying will happen, but if it does and when it does, it possibly will change their attitude quite dramatically.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. Final question. I want to give final word to Fred. So, Fred, you had mentioned about Industry 4.0, Construction 4.0, and then you also alluded to Industry 5.0. Oh. So, knowing that Industry 5.0 is moving more towards sustainability, resilience, well-being of workers, and so on, how do you see our move from technology to well-being more in Industry 5.0 and impacting safety?
So, I mean, God bless the fifth industrial revolution, if it does appear in the ways promised, which puts the people back in the middle, because I think we live far too often in an ahistorical society. So we forget what's gone before, because believe it or not, guys, I remember my life before this. Many in this room will not. And it was lovely. Frankly, everything was a lot slower. It was a lot better. Things worked out a lot easier. Back in the 1950s, there were promises when, I think it was probably the third industrial revolution. So people were promised the leisure society, machines and robots were going to do all our work for us. We'd have time off. Well, that's worked out well, hasn't it? Everyone's got 3 jobs and needs to run Uber and DoorDash to just keep themselves alive. This is not how the world has fallen out, except if you're the 1%, and then it has. But that doesn't help the majority of us. So we actually need to start thinking about how we're going to make that shift. Do we want AI to actually run our, is that going to help us, or is it going to make us more servile to technology in the long run? The fifth industrial revolution, I think, needs to come from young people, she says, looking at them all in the room, because we're all too old and tired to do this now. But we need to remember the importance of the human, of socialization, of actually what it means to be alive, what it means to be a good person. And I think that's really nice to see that coming back in, ideally through ways of well-being. I absolutely adore young people that won't take a job without knowing the salary, that quit because it's crap. Good. That's what you should do. Don't become slaves to this. And actually rethinking what is important in work, what is meaningful, good work, where we get satisfaction out of it. The construction industry is wonderful. You create something tangible. Very, very few jobs enable you to do that anymore. You make a difference in the places and spaces we live, work, and play. And these are important for the whole of society. We can put equality built into this. We can make this a much better world and a better society through construction. And I only hope that 5.0 will actually help us get to a much more equitable, equal, and fair place at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So it has indeed been a pleasure to have both of you give this seminar today.
Thank you.
We normally hold it only for 15 minutes. I think we took double the time. And I want to thank our audience physically, that those are present here, and also around the world, for staying with us, because this is indeed a very important topic. And you can see from the questions, I had several hands up here that I couldn't take the question for. So thank you again. Thank you, both of you.
Very welcome.
Just one quick word for all the early career researchers that are sitting here and also around the world, that you have complete access to CIB activities, particularly here at Purdue. We are members. You have complete access to all the CIB activities. So please participate and get into, if you're interested in safety and well-being, I think you have a place here as well. So with that said, let's give them a big round of applause. And those who are online, perhaps you can open your mics as well. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you
you.
indeed. With that said,
And that
thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Right, I don't know how to end. Leave. As Billy said on the screen, W099 is always this much fun. Come join us.